Picture a town square in the heart of medieval Europe. The cobblestones are slick with rain, and the crowd hums with anticipation. At the center, a woman, her belly swollen with child, is dragged forward in chains. She does not face mercy for carrying life. Instead, she faces judgment. The whispers rise: adultery, witchcraft, sin. The sentence is not protection, but punishment. And in that moment, pregnancy, once seen as sacred, becomes a crime. Across history, the womb has been treated as both miracle and threat. In myths, women who bore children were exalted as divine, chosen by gods to sustain humanity. Yet in reality, those same women were shackled, beaten, and executed if their pregnancies defied social rules. The body that gave life became a target of humiliation, its vulnerability exploited to send a message: obedience, silence, submission. This was not justice. It was theatre public spectacles, staged to remind societies who held power over life and birth. From Rome to the Ottoman Empire, from witch trials to harems, pregnant women endured punishment so dark they defy comprehension. Why did societies turn against the very women who carried their future? To answer, we must step into the shadows of history. Pregnancy has always been a paradox. Across civilizations, motherhood was exalted as divine, yet the very women who bore children often lived under the strictest chains. The womb, celebrated in myth and poetry, was simultaneously shackled by law and fear. Ancient societies understood that to control women's bodies was to control inheritance, power, and the future itself. And so, while pregnancy was hailed as sacred, it was also seized as property. In Egypt, the goddess Isis was revered as the ultimate mother, a protector of fertility and life. In Greece, Demeter's grief over her daughter symbolized the power of maternal bonds. Rome exalted motherhood in statues and ceremonies, holding up the image of the matron as ideal citizen. Pregnant women were painted into the heart of mythology itself, symbols of nurture, stability, and divine favor. But myths deceived. These images did not empower real women. They confined them, forcing them to embody ideals that erased their autonomy. A woman's worth was measured not by her mind or spirit, but by her capacity to bear children, preferably male heirs. And when she failed to conform, the same societies that deified her role turned against her with brutal precision. Pregnancy was never treated as private. In Rome, marriage contracts transferred a woman's fertility from father to husband, her womb becoming family property. Adultery wasn't just moral scandal, it was theft, a contamination of lineage. A pregnant woman outside wedlock carried proof of dishonor visible to all, and her punishment became a performance. In Mesopotamia, laws codified pregnancy as legal evidence. The Code of Hammurabi dictated that if a married woman was accused of adultery while pregnant, her body itself became the trial. Her swollen belly was proof of her crime, even if conceived in violence. The law was not interested in consent or circumstance, it was interested in ownership. Humiliation was often the chosen weapon. A pregnant woman could be paraded through streets, stripped, branded, or jeered at by neighbors. Her swollen body, instead of inspiring reverence, became a stage for communal mockery. Public trials ensured that shame outlived pain, embedding her humiliation into memory. In many regions, punishment went beyond the woman, it extended to the unborn child. Executing a pregnant woman was not only cruelty to her, but a declaration that the child, too, was unworthy. It was a collective erasure, mother and child silenced in one act. Religious institutions deepened the paradox. Christian doctrine praised the Virgin Mary, yet churches condemned unmarried pregnant women as sinners deserving of disgrace. In Islamicate empires, fertility was honored within marriage, but outside it, pregnancies were treated as scandal requiring harsh correction. In Hindu traditions, motherhood was revered, yet widows who became pregnant faced stigma and isolation. Sacred texts exalted fertility, but institutions enforced control. Priests, imams, and monks declared women blessed when obedient, cursed when defiant. Their authority transformed pregnancy into a site of constant scrutiny. At the heart of this control lay one fear: illegitimacy. A child born outside the sanctioned order threatened inheritance, property, and the honor of men. Kings feared rival heirs, husbands feared betrayal, priests feared scandal, and so punishments for pregnant women were designed not only to hurt, but to erase questions of paternity through death or shame. From public drownings to forced abortions, societies sought to cleanse dishonor through violence. In their eyes, the crime was not pregnancy itself, but the possibility that it might undermine male authority. In royal courts, pregnancy became entangled with politics. Concubines accused of bearing children that could rival heirs were executed, their pregnancies declared illegitimate threats. Queens who miscarried faced whispers of witchcraft or infidelity, their very bodies blamed for political instability. In the Ottoman harem, a pregnant concubine's fate could mean life or death, depending on who fathered her child. The womb was no longer sacred, it was a battlefield of dynastic power. The most striking cruelty lay in the contrast. The same societies that sang hymns to fertility and erected monuments to motherhood orchestrated brutal punishments for pregnant women who stepped outside prescribed boundaries. Life itself was turned into a liability. The child meant to be a blessing became a curse. Pregnancy was sacred, but only when controlled. When women claimed it on their own terms, it became dangerous, humiliating, punishable. And nowhere was this paradox more visible than in ancient Rome. A civilization that prided itself on law and order, Rome crafted some of the darkest punishments for women carrying life. To understand how far cruelty could go, we must walk into the heart of the empire, where wombs were not only controlled, but condemned. Rome loved to call itself civilized. Its marble temples, its grand forums, its laws carved in stone, all proclaimed a society governed by order and reason. But beneath the surface of that polished empire lay a system willing to destroy the most vulnerable lives to preserve its fragile honor. For Roman women, pregnancy was never just personal. It was evidence, liability, and often death sentence. Under the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, adultery was treated not merely as betrayal, but as an attack on property. A man's wife carried his lineage, his heirs, his honor. If she became pregnant by another, the unborn child represented contamination, proof that another man's blood threatened the sanctity of the family line. Punishment was swift and merciless. A husband could expose his wife, dragging her before magistrates. If found guilty, she might be stripped, humiliated, and executed, even if her belly already carried life. In Rome's eyes, the child was not innocent. It was evidence of sin. Execution erased both mother and child in one brutal act, cleansing dishonor through blood. But husbands were not the only ones with power. Roman fathers retained patria potestas, absolute authority over their households. If a daughter became pregnant outside marriage, her father could kill her without trial. Pregnancy was the ultimate proof of disobedience, and her body became both confession and condemnation. Imagine the terror of a young Roman girl, her pregnancy discovered not in whispers, but in the visible swelling of her body. She needed no trial, no testimony. Her father's word was enough to seal her fate. Execution became not justice, but a ritual of control, sanctioned by law, sanctified by tradition. Rome's obsession with purity extended to its most sacred priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. Chosen as children, they were sworn to 30 years of celibacy, guardians of the eternal flame of Vesta. Their role was honored, their presence essential to Rome's spiritual security. But if a Vestal was found pregnant, it was not seen as human failure, it was divine betrayal. The punishment was among the cruelest in history. A Vestal was not executed publicly, for spilling her blood was considered sacrilege. Instead, she was buried alive. Picture the ritual: a narrow underground chamber prepared with a couch, a lamp, a loaf of bread, and a jug of water. The priestesses were led in silence, veiled and bound, while the crowd watched. Lowered into the earth, the chamber was sealed. The flame above continued to burn, but her own flame, her life, her unborn child's life, was extinguished in darkness. The paradox was chilling. A woman chosen to embody purity, if she became pregnant, was turned into a symbol of shame so powerful it demanded erasure by burial. Rome did not kill her alone. It killed the child within, burying innocence with supposed sin. If noble women faced execution, enslaved women endured something different: weaponized reproduction. Slave girls were treated as breeding stock. Their pregnancies were not celebrated but exploited. Masters forced them into pregnancies to increase their wealth. For every child born was another slave added to their property. But if a slave woman became pregnant outside her master's control, or worse, by another man, punishment could be merciless. Some were whipped until miscarriage, others were branded, starved, or worked to exhaustion to end pregnancies deemed inconvenient. For enslaved women, pregnancy was not protection, it was another tool of subjugation. Writers like Juvenal and Martial joked about the abuse of slave women, mocking pregnancies as inconveniences for masters rather than lives to be cherished. Behind the humor was cruelty so normalized it barely registered as crime. These women carried children into a world where both mother and infant were destined for chains. Rome rarely missed an opportunity for theater, and pregnancy did not grant mercy from spectacle. Women accused of crimes while pregnant were sometimes executed in arenas, their bellies a grotesque addition to the drama. Accounts describe condemned women thrown to beasts, torn apart before roaring crowds. It was not just about punishment, it was about demonstration. Rome's message was clear: not even the unborn would be spared if their mothers defied law or custom. The womb, symbol of life, became stage for death. Beyond law and slavery, pregnancy played a role in Rome's ruthless politics. Emperors feared rival heirs, and concubines or noblewomen carrying children not sanctioned by the state often faced death. Rumors of pregnancy could spark scandal and execution alike. A woman's body was not her own, it was a chess piece in dynastic games. One infamous case was that of Julia the Elder, daughter of Augustus. Accused of adultery, her pregnancies became political scandals. Though spared immediate execution, she was exiled, humiliated, and erased from Rome's honor. Her story reveals how pregnancy, once celebrated, could become evidence of betrayal used to dismantle women's lives. What makes Rome's treatment of pregnant women uniquely dark is its symbolism. To execute a woman carrying life was not only to kill, it was to erase lineage, to obliterate potential. It was a way of declaring that dishonor itself was hereditary, and that society had the right to extinguish it before it breathed. This was not justice, it was control disguised as law, humiliation disguised as morality. It revealed the empire's deepest fear, that women might create life beyond the reach of male authority. As Rome fell and Europe entered the medieval age, these patterns did not disappear. They evolved. Pregnant women accused of witchcraft or immorality faced humiliations just as dark, though cloaked in the language of faith and sin. To understand this next chapter, we must step into the fires and tribunals of medieval Europe, where carrying life could mean being burned alive. When Rome crumbled, its laws and institutions scattered. But the obsession with controlling women's bodies, especially pregnant ones, did not vanish. It shifted into new forms, fueled by the growing power of the Church, the rise of superstition, and the tightening grip of patriarchal order. In medieval and early modern Europe, pregnancy was still sacred in sermons, celebrated in hymns to the Virgin Mary. Yet in practice, a pregnant woman was always under suspicion. Her body, instead of protection, often became evidence-proof of sin, witchcraft, or crime. Witchcraft accusations were among the darkest forces in Europe's history, and pregnancy offered no shield. In fact, it often made women more vulnerable. A swelling belly could be twisted into a mark of witchcraft, evidence that a woman had lain with demons or carried the spawn of the devil. Witch hunters wrote manuals advising interrogators to check pregnant women for unnatural signs, birthmarks, miscarriages, or difficult labors, all of which could be construed as proof of witchcraft. Pregnant women accused of sorcery were not spared execution. In Germany, France, and Scotland, records describe trials where women in their final months were condemned to burning. Some were even executed alongside their newborns, the child declared tainted by the mother's alleged sins. Others were forced to give birth in prison cells only to be hanged or drowned soon after. The medieval obsession with public spectacle transformed trials into rituals of humiliation. Pregnant women suspected of adultery, heresy, or witchcraft were subjected to ordeals meant to expose guilt through suffering. One infamous test was the ordeal by water. A woman sometimes visibly pregnant was bound and thrown into a river. If she sank, she was innocent, though often drowned. If she floated, her body was considered buoyed by Satan, and she was executed. Imagine the terror, a mother fighting for breath, her unborn child's fate tied to the superstition of a crowd. Other ordeals included forced fasting, where a pregnant woman was denied food or water until confession. Some were compelled to walk barefoot over burning coals, their condition ignored. For the church and its courts, pain was proof, and pregnancy was no shield against cruelty. The church also framed miscarriage as punishment from God. A woman who lost her child was often accused of sinning, cursed for secret immorality or witchcraft. Instead of compassion, she received suspicion. Chroniclers describe women who miscarried facing interrogation, accused of poisoning their own wombs to cover up adultery or to practice forbidden abortion spells. These accusations became particularly vicious during times of famine or plague, when societies sought scapegoats. Pregnant women whose children did not survive were paraded as warnings, evidence that God's wrath had found them guilty. Their private grief was twisted into public shame. For unmarried women, pregnancy itself was a crime. Throughout Europe, women who bore children outside wedlock were branded as immoral and subjected to degrading punishments. In some towns, they were forced to wear distinctive clothing marking them as sinners. Others were whipped publicly, their bellies exposed as symbols of disgrace. One particularly cruel ritual involved forcing an unmarried pregnant woman to walk through the village barefoot, carrying a heavy stone or cross, while neighbors jeered. Her body was not just humiliated, it was used as moral theater for the community. Every step reminded others of the dangers of disobedience. This cruelty contrasted sharply with the Church's veneration of the Virgin Mary, the archetype of holy motherhood. Sermons exalted her obedience, her purity, her sacred pregnancy. Yet ordinary women could never live up to this impossible standard. If they carried children outside marriage, they were condemned. If they lost children, they were cursed. If they carried pregnancies while accused of sin, they were punished. Mary symbolized perfection, but her image became a weapon used to measure and condemn women who could never be so untouched, so silent, so obedient. The same faith that praised motherhood also sanctioned burning mothers alive at the stake. In 16th century Würzburg, Germany, records describe a pregnant woman accused of witchcraft and executed by fire. Chroniclers noted not only her death but the death of her unborn child, emphasizing that evil was purged from two bodies at once. In Scotland, a midwife accused of using charms during childbirth was condemned for sorcery. Her pregnancy was declared further proof of her unnatural practices. Even royalty was not immune. Rumours of queens' pregnancies could be weaponized in political struggles. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, suffered miscarriages and was accused of witchcraft, adultery, and incest. Though not executed while pregnant, her lost children were cited as evidence of God's judgment, sealing her downfall. Just as in Rome, execution was often public spectacle. Pregnant women accused of witchcraft were dragged to marketplaces, stripped, and displayed before burning or hanging. These events were not merely punishments, they were warnings. Communities gathered to watch, children witnessed, and the message was carved deep. Disobedience, especially in women, would not be tolerated even if it meant extinguishing 2 lives instead of 1. The humiliation often outlasted death. Chronicles mocked women who pleaded for mercy, branding them harlots or daughters of Satan. Their reputations were destroyed so completely that even in memory they were denied dignity. Why did medieval and early modern Europe direct such venom at pregnant women? Because pregnancy, while celebrated in sacred art, terrified patriarchal structures. It carried the potential for illegitimate heirs, for children born beyond the control of marriage, for women's sexuality to exist outside male authority. And so societies punished not only the women, but the very act of bringing life. While Europe burned witches and shamed mothers, the Ottoman Empire and Eastern courts devised their own forms of cruelty. In harems and dynasties, pregnancy was weaponized as a tool of politics. Concubines carrying the wrong heir could be executed, their wombs turned into symbols of scandal. To see this next chapter, we must step into the palaces of sultans and emperors, where life itself became bargaining chip in games of power. While Europe's witch trials scarred villages and cathedrals with the screams of pregnant women, the Eastern empires wielded cruelty in more calculated ways. In the courts of sultans, shahs, and emperors, pregnancy was not merely a matter of morality, it was politics, dynasty, and survival. To carry life within palace walls could be either the greatest protection or the surest death sentence. In the Ottoman Empire, the harem was both sanctuary and prison. Behind the silk curtains and jeweled halls lived women whose bodies were entangled in dynastic ambitions. A concubine pregnant with the sultan's child might rise to power, gaining influence as the mother of a future heir. But if her pregnancy threatened the plans of rivals, that same body became target for elimination. Concubines accused of carrying illegitimate heirs were drowned in the Bosporus or strangled with silk cords. Pregnancy did not grant mercy, it amplified risk. The womb became evidence in succession struggles, a battlefield where politics decided whether a child lived to rule or died in silence. The greatest fear of dynasties was fragmentation. Too many heirs meant civil war. To prevent this, some rulers ordered the execution of pregnant concubines whose children could complicate succession. Chronicles describe palace midwives forced to report pregnancies, their silence punishable by death. Rival women in the harem whispered accusations, turning pregnancy into scandal overnight. One chilling example comes from the reign of Mehmed III, who executed 19 of his half-brothers upon ascending the throne. Such brutality extended to women suspected of carrying potential rivals. Concubines disappeared in the night, their pregnancies erased to secure stability. Beyond execution, humiliation played a role. In Persian courts, concubines accused of adultery during pregnancy were paraded publicly, their bellies exposed as proof of betrayal. They were stripped of silks, draped instead in rags, and displayed to mock the scandal their bodies supposedly carried. These spectacles reminded the empire that even within the grandeur of palaces, women remained vulnerable to the cruelty of men's politics. Sharia law, when interpreted harshly, treated pregnancy outside marriage as irrefutable evidence of zina, fornication, or adultery. A woman's swollen belly was considered confession. Trials could result in flogging or stoning, punishments designed not only to kill, but to humiliate. Accounts from North Africa and the Middle East describe women buried waist-deep in sand and pelted with stones, their pregnancies dismissed as corrupted life unworthy of protection. Neighbors gathered to watch, turning execution into performance. Just as in Europe, the womb was transformed from sacred vessel into public evidence of crime. In the Indian subcontinent, dynastic politics mirrored these fears. Mughal emperors, like their Ottoman counterparts, treated concubines' pregnancies as threats or assets. Women who bore sons could wield influence, but rivals often poisoned or accused them to prevent challenges to favored heirs. In Hindu traditions, widows who became pregnant were condemned, accused of impurity or witchcraft. Some faced ritual humiliations, heads shaved, bellies mocked, cast out from their families. Society that praised fertility in married women turned ferociously against those who carried life outside sanctioned norms. In the East, fertility was worshipped in poetry, sculpture, and myth. Goddesses of motherhood Shakti, Durga, fertility spirits in folk traditions, were adored. Yet for real women, especially those within courts, fertility was a trap. Their bodies carried dynastic power, but also danger. To be pregnant was to walk a tightrope between elevation and annihilation. Life in the harem was gilded but perilous. Women were trained to charm, entertain, and bear children, but their success marked them for jealousy. Pregnant concubines were watched, monitored, and sometimes poisoned. Those accused of disobedience could be locked in chambers, forced to miscarry through starvation or beatings. Imagine the silence of a palace chamber, a young woman alone, clutching her belly, knowing her child's life depended not on nature, but on politics. The same halls that echoed with music and poetry concealed unspeakable cruelties against expectant mothers. Some dynasties developed rituals for executing pregnant women to mask political motives with divine justification. In certain Persian courts, pregnant women accused of adultery were drowned in sacred pools, their deaths framed as purification. In Ottoman narratives, strangling concubines with silk cords was justified as merciful bloodless, yet the unborn life within was extinguished just as coldly. These deaths were not random. They were messages carefully staged to show that no woman, no child, no womb existed outside the authority of the throne. What made Eastern practices particularly haunting was how closely they mirrored Western ones despite vast cultural differences. Both worlds celebrated fertility in myth while punishing it in reality. Both used pregnancy as evidence, as spectacle, as weapon. And in both, women's suffering was normalized, justified, sanctified by law, custom, or divine decree. But the story of pregnant women's punishment is not only about courts, harems, or laws, it is also about devices, iron, wood, fire, designed to torment pregnant bodies with chilling precision. From cages that constricted swollen bellies to rituals that mocked motherhood itself, societies engineered tools to transform life-bearing bodies into instruments of shame. To uncover these tools, we must enter the chambers where torture became invention. When we think of torture devices, images of racks, iron maidens, and spiked wheels come to mind. But what happens when these instruments of cruelty are turned against the most vulnerable pregnant women? History records not only punishments, but inventions designed to torment the body carrying life. Devices of iron, rituals of fire, spectacles of humiliation, each crafted with the same goal, to transform pregnancy from sacred into shameful. One of the most horrifying punishments was the use of iron corsets and cages designed to compress the swelling body. These devices, lined with spikes or tightened with screws, pressed against the abdomen and ribs, making every movement agony. For a pregnant woman, the effect was catastrophic. Pressure restricted breathing, bruised organs, and in many cases caused miscarriages. The cruelty was symbolic as well as physical. By enclosing the womb in iron, society announced that even life itself could be chained, controlled, suffocated. These cages were not secret tools, but public displays, women forced to wear them in markets or homes, their pain visible for all to see. In medieval Europe, pregnant women accused of immorality were sometimes branded on the stomach, the scar intended to outlast the child. Heated irons pressed into swollen flesh not only inflicted unbearable pain, but marked the woman permanently, ensuring shame followed her long after. Other punishments involved burning herbs or coals near the womb as symbolic cleansing. Chroniclers describe rituals where women were forced to kneel over smouldering fires, the heat directed at their bellies to purify sin. These ceremonies blended torture with theatre, turning motherhood into public spectacle. Whipping was among the most common punishments across societies, and pregnancy offered no protection. Women were flogged in marketplaces, their cries echoing through crowds while unborn children absorbed the violence. In some cases, heavy stones were strapped to their backs or stomachs, forcing them to stagger through streets as neighbors jeered. The symbolism was cruelly simple. The stone represented the weight of sin, the whip, the cleansing of shame. Yet both punished not only the woman but the fragile life she carried, reducing pregnancy to a stage for humiliation. Records from parts of Central Europe mention torture chairs modified for pregnant women. Spiked seats forced them to sit while weight pressed down on their abdomens. Some were tied for hours, the spikes puncturing skin, while interrogators demanded confessions of witchcraft or adultery. The brutality of these chairs lay in their design. They prolonged pain without immediate death. For women already carrying the exhaustion of pregnancy, such devices amplified suffering into spectacle. Their swollen bodies became evidence of guilt, their cries fuel for communal entertainment. Beyond devices, rituals themselves acted as torture. Pregnant women accused of witchcraft were sometimes forced to fast, starved until both mother and child weakened. Others endured the ordeal of walking penance, paraded barefoot through villages, carrying crosses or stones while mocked. In Eastern traditions, women were sometimes forced to drink potions meant to induce miscarriage, a form of chemical torture disguised as justice. These brews, often made of herbs and toxins, caused convulsions, bleeding, and death. To punish a woman, society destroyed both her body and the life within, cloaked in the language of ritual cleansing. The infamous scold, bridle, and iron muzzle used to silence women was also used on pregnant women accused of gossip or defiance. For expectant mothers, the bridle's cruel symbolism deepened. While the womb was controlled with shame, the voice was silenced with iron. Some bridles were modified with spikes pressing into the tongue, ensuring every attempt to speak resulted in blood. Imagine the cruelty of a woman heavy with child, forced to march through town with iron locked around her head, her cries reduced to gurgles of pain. The bridle was not simply punishment, it was performance, a reminder that both body and voice could be stripped of dignity. Some instruments targeted pregnancy directly. The pair of anguish, inserted and expanded within the body, caused internal tearing. While often used as punishment for accusations of immorality, it was particularly devastating for pregnant women, inducing miscarriage with agony. Midwives accused of witchcraft sometimes faced cruel iron hooks, said to be used for extracting evidence of their crimes, an obscene euphemism for destroying pregnancies. These tools reflected society's darkest fear, women controlling reproduction outside male authority. The punishment was not only pain, but the destruction of potential life. The communal aspect of these punishments cannot be overstated. Pregnant women were rarely punished in secret. Their bodies became stages where cruelty was displayed to reinforce social order. Market squares filled with neighbors watching as women endured whippings, brandings, or executions. Children learned that disobedience led not only to pain, but to humiliation so deep it erased identity. The unborn child, rather than inspiring protection, became part of the performance. Its very existence made punishment more shocking, more memorable, more terrifying. The spectacle ensured the message outlived the woman herself. The darkest irony lay in the contrast. Societies praised motherhood in poems, hymns, and art. They glorified fertility as divine blessing. Yet when women bore children outside sanctioned rules, those same societies turned vicious, inventing devices to crush, humiliate, and destroy. Pregnancy, symbol of hope, was transformed into tool of punishment. The womb, source of life, became a target for cruelty. Devices that should never have existed were forged in iron, justified by faith, wielded by law. These instruments and rituals were not accidents of cruelty. They were deliberate, designed to control the most sacred act of creation itself. But perhaps the most haunting truth is not just the pain inflicted, it is how these punishments were remembered, or rather forgotten. Many are reduced to curiosities in museums, stripped of context, their victims erased. To understand the weight of this silence, we must turn to history, as reflection how societies today remember or ignore the suffering of pregnant women who endured such torment. Across centuries, across empires, across cultures, one theme has remained constant. The body of a pregnant woman has rarely been hers alone. It has been a battlefield for law, a canvas for ritual, a pawn in politics, and too often the stage for humiliation and cruelty. From Rome's executions to Europe's witch trials, from Ottoman palaces to village squares, punishment did not merely harm women, it silenced them, erased them, and warned others through their suffering. What is most chilling is not only the punishments themselves, but how easily they were forgotten. Devices that once pierced flesh now sit behind glass in museums labeled curiosities. Chronicles that once mocked victims now serve as dry historical records. Names of women who endured these humiliations are rarely remembered, their stories reduced to footnotes or myths. The Iron Maiden may be a fabrication, yet the real devices, the scold's bridle, the iron corset, the pair of anguish, were all too real. And they were used not on nameless abstractions, but on living women, often pregnant, carrying futures that would never arrive. This silence reveals a deeper cruelty. The pain was not only physical, it was historical. By erasing victims, societies denied them the dignity of remembrance. We inherit not their voices, but the shadows left behind. Why humiliation? Why was pain not enough? Because humiliation lingers. A scar can heal, but shame echoes through memory, through community, through generations. Punishing a pregnant woman in public was not just about her, it was about every woman who watched. The message was clear: your body is not your own, your womb is not your sanctuary, your life is conditional. Humiliation turned punishment into theatre, and theatre into policy. Crowds learned lessons from the screams of their neighbours. Children grew up watching shame paraded as justice. This psychological violence was as powerful as the physical, embedding fear deep into the cultural fabric. It is tempting to leave these horrors in the past, to imagine we are distant from Rome's arenas or Europe's stakes. But echoes remain. Around the world today, women still face punishment tied to reproduction. Laws policing abortion, cultures that shame unwed mothers, governments that deny reproductive rights, all echo the same obsession: controlling the womb. In some countries, pregnant women imprisoned for alleged immorality endure conditions not far removed from medieval dungeons. In others, honor killings claim women whose pregnancies expose family shame. Even in so-called modern societies, the pregnant body is politicized, legislated, monitored, often without the woman's consent. History is not gone, it is alive, reshaped in new forms. So what do we do with this history? To remember is the first act of resistance. To speak the names of the silenced is to restore dignity. Each device, each ritual, each execution tells not only of cruelty but of resilience, the fact that women endured, survived, resisted in ways that often went unrecorded. Memory becomes weapon. By telling these stories, we refuse to allow the past to vanish into myth. We confront the systems that justified brutality and recognize how similar logics still shape our world. For centuries, these punishments told a story that women's bodies were dangerous, sinful, in need of control. But history does not belong to executioners alone. Reclaiming the narrative means telling the story differently, not from the perspective of law, church, or throne, but from the perspective of those who suffered. The pregnant woman forced to wear iron, the witch burned with her unborn child, the concubine drowned in a palace pool. These are not just victims, they are witnesses. Their suffering exposes the violence embedded in systems of power. By telling their stories, we strip away the disguises of justice and morality that cloaked their tormentors. To study these darkest punishments is not to indulge in horror for its own sake. It is to learn what societies are capable of when fear and control outweigh compassion. It is to recognize the fragility of progress, how easily rights can be revoked, how quickly dignity can be erased. The legacy of these punishments is a warning. When we hear laws justified in the name of morality, when we see women's choices restricted in the name of tradition, we must remember the cages, the whips, the flames. History tells us where such justifications can lead. Imagine again the town square, the palace chamber, the execution ground. A woman stands, heavy with child, her body trembling as punishment begins. Around her, a crowd watches. For them, it is theatre. For her, it is the end. And yet, in telling her story now, we pull her from the shadows. We give her voice where silence once reigned. The darkest punishments for pregnant women in history remind us of a truth both terrifying and necessary, that cruelty thrives in silence, but memory can defy it. These women were meant to be erased. Instead, by remembering, we ensure they remain not as objects of shame, but as testaments to resilience, warnings carved into history itself.